Good evening. The Queen has outlined the government's legislative agenda for the year ahead at the state opening of Parliament. But this Queen's speech, the first in over 2 years, was delivered in the midst of the political and constitutional crisis provoked by Brexit and drafted by a government with no majority in the Commons. So there were immediate questions about the feasibility of Boris Johnson's programme, which included planned measures on crime and health and delivering Brexit on the 31st of October. Opposition parties say that with an election in the offing, the Queen's speech was nothing more than a sham. As our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, explains.
Plenty of pomp, but very bizarre circumstances. The band playing for the monarch's arrival. The Queen and the Crown here to announce the government's plans. But they're a wish list at the very best, going through the traditional motions. For a programme that might never happen.
Black Rod!
If this first promise is not kept.
My government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October.
That's a huge if, and the doubts over Brexit dwarf the government's other ambitions.
New laws will be taken forward to help implement the National Health Service's long-term plan in England.
Whether that's more funding for the health service, a point system for immigration or longer criminal sentences.
My government is committed to addressing violent crime and to strengthening public confidence in the criminal justice system. New sentencing laws will see that the most serious offenders spend longer in custody to reflect better the severity of their crimes.
This unlikely pair aren't inclined to agree on any of that, whatever small talk Boris Johnson was trying and failing to make. Jeremy Corbyn's answer was unlikely to be, sure, no problem. This government has no majority, and the Prime Minister wants a better outcome than his predecessor. But just like Theresa May, Boris Johnson wants an early election.
The legislative programme, Mr. Speaker, is a propaganda exercise that the government cannot disguise. This government has failed on Brexit for over 3 years. They're barely beginning to undo the damage of a decade of cuts to our public services. The Prime Minister promised that this Queen's speech would dazzle us. On closer inspection, Mr. Speaker, it is nothing more than fool's gold.
Prime Minister! As we prepare to get Brexit done by October the 31st, we are setting out now our vision of an open, global, free-trading United Kingdom, a high-wage, low-tax economy, the best place to invest, the best place to start a business, the best place to start a family and send your kids to school, and without being chauvinistic or disrespectful to anywhere else in the world. In important respects, this country is the greatest place to live and to be.
Cheered at the end by his own side. But this Prime Minister's fate right now rests elsewhere, in the hands of diplomats and his own negotiators in Brussels, waiting, waiting and waiting. After the EU said no, no and no again to the Prime Minister's proposals, there is now at least an Irish maybe to a deal.
A deal is possible, and it's possible this month, may even be possible this week, but we're not there yet.
Whether or not there's a deal matters more than anything said in Parliament today. It is just about possible to see how it could happen this week, but there's a lot of secrecy about exactly how. One Cabinet Minister said we are still in the middle of the forest, and even if there is an agreement, it would still have to get through the Commons.
There is no form of Brexit that will be good for our country. And the Liberal Democrats will continue to fight to stop Brexit.
Deal or no deal, the Prime Minister is driving Scotland and the UK into economic catastrophe, risking jobs, livelihoods and delivering a race to the bottom on fundamental rights.
I do think that the sooner we are able to implement the result of that referendum, the better.
But a wish for sooner rather than later just doesn't mean much yet. In modern political life, even traditions take on a different style. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as we've heard, among the policies outlined in the Queen's speech earlier, priority was given to taking the UK out of the European Union by the 31st of October. There was also a new immigration bill which would end free movement and introduce a new points-based system. The sentencing bill called for longer sentences for serious offenders and foreign criminals. And the Environment Bill would set legally binding targets to reduce the impact of climate change, including improving water quality and cutting air pollution. Well, let's go live to Westminster and join our political editor there, Laura Kunsberg. Laura, first of all, the blunt question, is any of this content in the Queen's speech likely to become law?
Well, Hugh, this is a wish list, not a workable list, because this is a government that doesn't have a majority to call its own. And therefore, unless and until that changes, this is a list, a programme for government that Boris Johnson would like to enact if he had the numbers, but he doesn't. So unless he manages to tip into the general election campaign that he so desires and wins a majority, which is, of course, a heroic if for the Conservative Party, as things stand, this is a taste of what the Tories would like to do in a different climate, but absolutely not a series of cast iron commitments. And what happens in terms of getting a Brexit deal or not is the biggest determinant of that.
And Laura, just one more point on this, which is to do really with the overriding context of Brexit, clearly, and the likelihood or not of a deal. Where are we there?
Well, Downing Street is trying to be extremely tight-lipped. Cabinet ministers tell me that's a good sign because it means it's genuine. The fact that things aren't leaking out all over the place suggests that actually both sides are acting in good faith. Both the UK and the EU negotiators are doing their best under trying conditions. But the fact that the proposals are not seeping out to get the oxygen of political criticism to be torn down from their opponents is something that is actually on the side of a deal happening. But the DUP, whose votes the government wants very dearly, were in Downing Street tonight. They had talks with the Prime Minister for an hour and a half. No suggestion really of any concrete proposals being put forward. But it's clear that both sides here are willing perhaps to show a bit of leg, to budge a little bit. Whether ultimately means that they can come together in time to get a deal by the end of this week, we just don't know yet.
OK, Laura, thanks very much. Laura Kunsberg there. Let's go live to our Europe editor, Katja Adler, who's in Berlin. And Katja, what are you picking up from the European Union on the likelihood or not of a deal?
Well, that's right, Hugh. I'm in Berlin today. I'll be in Paris tomorrow for some background chats ahead of the EU leaders summit this week. And just really to get the idea of whether they think that there can be a deal with Boris Johnson or not. And it's a bit confusing from the outside, isn't it? Because last week we got the feeling there was an understanding between the Irish Prime Minister and Boris Johnson. There was hope in the air. Right now, though, there's no sign of smoke that a Brexit deal is nigh. The main sticking point remains replacing that Irish backstop, and particularly when it comes to customs. The EU, Hugh, has got two main priorities here. One, protecting the Northern Ireland peace process, and so Berlin and Paris say they're delighted that Ireland and the UK are talking. The second priority, though, is protecting the EU's single market after Brexit, and EU leaders think the Prime Minister's proposals don't go far enough. They are hoping, Germany and others, that time pressure and political pressure on the Prime Minister, he is the one who wanted to promise a new Brexit deal this week, will make him pivot towards the EU's preferred solution, which is pretty much keeping Northern Ireland inside the EU's customs union after Brexit. Now, the Prime Minister has said no, and really, I don't think there's enough time, nobody does here, to work out a detailed middle ground between the two sides before Thursday. Tonight, there's talk of a possible communique that would say there's been progress, but we need more time, and then all EU eyes will turn to Westminster to see if there'll be a request for a new Brexit extension or not.
Katja, many thanks once again. Katja Adler there, our Europe editor in Berlin.